saving lives one dose at a time. India's Serum Institute, how a small-scale family business became the global vaccine powerhouse. Now, CEO Adar Poonawalla has his sights set on new treatments and new markets in the fast-paced world of biotech.
We never imagined that we would be, the largest vaccine producer. If you told us, we would have laughed at that, even 10 years ago.
He shares the inside story of Serum's COVID response.
We're in a race to procure raw material that was sanctioned.
And why he's taking on vaccine fatigue and the culture wars which have dented public confidence in science.
India is in the spotlight, the world's most populous nation. Centuries of culture and tradition, a global powerhouse in business, science and technology. And when it comes to vaccines, India really is number one. Adar, good to see you.
Enter Adar Poonawalla, CEO of the Serum Institute of India, the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines and architect of its rapid growth. We meet in the heart of its state-of-the-art 42-acre campus in Pune.
You're seen as the jewel of India's biotech industry. You're done way better than the big boys in the industry, like your Glaxos and your Sanofis and your Mercks. I mean, how does it feel to be in that position, and how do you stay competitive in such an environment?
Well, I wouldn't say we're, the best, but, some of the companies you mentioned, like GSK, Merck, they have tremendous capabilities of innovation and developing new vaccines and drugs, and they're very wealthy companies where they can spend billions of dollars on clinical trials and things like that. We can't do that. We make a few $100 million a year in profits, and that's just barely enough to keep the infrastructure going and, do a few trials. For example, we just recently launched our malaria vaccine, the second malaria vaccine in the world. That's going out to the African countries this year. That took us 6 to 7 years to fund and develop through different stages. Very similarly with the HPV vaccine, which is the cervical cancer vaccine for women. So it takes us a bit longer because, funding and other reasons. So I think both groups of companies between the East and the West have their advantages and disadvantages. Our labor costs are lower, our energy costs are lower, so we can be more efficient. Our people work harder, they work for longer hours. So there are pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages that both have.
Talk to us about plans to scale in terms of your malaria vaccine, your cervical cancer vaccines. I mean, what's the 3 to 5 year plan?
We've built a capacity of roughly about 100 million doses for each of the vaccines. Right now, the demand for the malaria vaccines is not even half that. It's slowly picking up as the countries gear up in Africa to, receive the vaccine, to use the vaccine. There's a lot of planning that happens at the introductory stage. So I think in about 2 years' time, they'll probably reach a demand level of 100 million doses, which will be matched by the supply. And very similarly, there's a global shortage of the HPV vaccine as well. A lot of countries need it, and there are very few vaccine manufacturers, again, producing this vaccine because it's very complicated and difficult to make. Over the next 2 to 3 years, that demand-supply mismatch will also be sort of addressed with the supply going out from Serum Institute.
Is there any clarity on the kind of growth you're anticipating in the next maybe 3 to 5 years? Because you've said before that some years you don't grow, other years you grow at 30%. Is there any clarity the kind of growth you're looking at?
Yeah, I think we'll probably double our capacity over the next 5 years. So we're selling around 1.5 billion doses of vaccines at the moment. I think that could easily reach 3 billion doses in the next 5 years. What I meant by that is it's not a linear growth. So some years, if there aren't many catch-up campaigns or outbreaks, then you don't grow that much. But then suddenly there'll be an outbreak in certain areas, or there'll be a new vaccine that's launched, and a budget is approved for that. So, countries can then procure those vaccines, and that's when you see the growth. Of course, during the COVID pandemic, it was like a 400, 500% growth on the turnover, because that was an exceptional year.
Let's talk about your reflections on the devastation, not just in India, but the world. What was it like trying to produce a vaccine under such circumstances?
Well, it was unprecedented in every respect. Firstly, we were being watched and questioned every minute of the way. We were in a race to procure raw material that was sanctioned because everyone was clamoring for it. It wasn't just raw material, it was even, equipments and things that we needed to build our facilities. And we couldn't even fly out engineers and equipment at that time, so we were chartering flights to do it because, at the peak of in 2020 and 2021, there were many restrictions on being able to fly and visas and all of that sort of thing. Once we got over that, I think it was just the challenge of rolling out as much production as possible, but also balancing which countries get what and trying to satisfy all stakeholders, including our own partners who wanted the vaccines. So we got through that with a lot of difficulty and lessons that we learned. And that is why we need to have, going forward, like a pandemic accords and strategy that the WHO is working on. And I hope that all the countries sign up to it and adhere to it, because otherwise we'll be in exactly the same situation as we were then.
How do you ensure that the global south in particular, the emerging economies, the poor economies get access, because that was not what we saw? What needs to happen for us to learn from that lesson in particular?
Well, some people have talked about regional manufacturing and developing more manufacturing sites all over the world. That's a little more challenging than just talking about it, because you need the expertise, the technology, and you need a market in those areas to sustain those facilities. What I have proposed to some of the governments is to give a kind of reservation fee to facilities around the world, whereby in the case of a pandemic, it's like insurance, where you can push a button and say, okay, now I need your facilities to make XYZ vaccine. But even that's challenging, because which technology would be working at that time? You still need to go through clinical trials to get a vaccine approved. How soon can you do that? Some of the things I have done to ensure that the world would be safer is to have facilities in the UK, in Europe, which would be available at the time of a pandemic, so it's outside of India.
Right now, the big concern is a drop in vaccine uptake, fueled by culture war conspiracies and nagging suspicions around the lasting impact of the COVID shots.
There's also a lot of vaccine skepticism. How do you counter that? I mean, people say that there needs to be proper studies done on the long-term effects of these vaccines.
Absolutely right. Most of these vaccines, that's why they take so long to develop, because you do get an opportunity to check the long-term effects. During a pandemic, sadly, you don't have the time. And there's always this risk-reward benefit to say that, do you take a vaccine now that we know can protect you and prevent hospitalizations, and worry about some possible long-term side effects in the future? So that's what a regulator decides before licensing a vaccine, before it goes out into the general population. In most of the cases, I think the vaccines have been quite safe and good. But yes, of course, all drugs and vaccines give reactions. But this is something I wanted to make very clear, that 2 years later, no one needs to be worried about anything that you can get from a vaccine shot that you took 2 years ago. I'm yet to see any evidence to support a long-term vaccine reaction.
India has earned the reputation of being the world's generic drug maker. But in recent years, it's earned a bad reputation for falling short in terms of quality. Do you think India runs the risk of having its reputation being tainted?
Well, I mean, I think these were isolated incidences with some smaller pharmaceutical companies. But if you look at most of the large generic pharma companies, they're all US and EU approved, even we are. We supply our vaccines to the US. We have regular inspections, and so do most companies. And I don't see the major suppliers of the generic drugs or vaccine manufacturers having ever had any major quality issues. So I'm not really too worried about it.
Coming up, back to where it all began, how the family stud farm was key to unlocking Serum's success.
I remember the struggles we had in terms of, recruiting talent, raising capital, getting access to technology to really be able to make all these vaccines.
When Latitude returns. A short drive from the bustle of downtown Pune is a Poonawalla stud farm. Founded in the 1940s, it's raised generations of winning race horses, but it's also played a key role in the Serum story.
What started here on a stud farm nearly 60 years ago has turned into a $25 billion global business, all thanks to the family's passion for horse racing.
In 1966, Cyrus Poonawalla, Adar's father, founded the Serum Institute. Thanks to a chance conversation with a vet, he took a gamble on using the stud's retired racehorses, tapping the clear fluid from their blood plasma to produce vaccines. It was a business breakthrough that allowed the Poonawallas to produce cut-price treatments and corner the market.
You're in this facility, which is part of your $2 billion investment in the last 2 years. It's a massive amount.
Yes, because we focused a lot on automation and upgrading our quality standards so that we can adhere to the US FDA and European standards, because some of our vaccines now are going even to the West, which is a fundamental shift in our strategy, from back in the day when my father started the business, where we were predominantly in India and the developing countries.
India-centric, now you're more global.
Yes.
So you're about 8,000 strong in this facility? All Indian nationals?
Mostly Indian, yes. I would say 99% of talent that we've trained overseas and in India.
How do you reach that critical mass to ensure that, you get the talent, meet the people?
Well, it's always a struggle, and that's why we have our own internal skill building center where we train on site. So every facility has perhaps 30-40% new talent, which comes and gets trained by the people who've been doing it for years. So as you can see, back in the day, all this would be manually done. So what's happening here is the vials in which you put in the vaccine are being washed and sterilized. So this is an automated washing machine, which at high pressure injects water, distilled water, purified water into the vial to first just wash it out at high pressure. And then over here, this is a tunnel which heats the empty vial with dry heat on a conveyor belt as it passes through at something like 200 degrees centigrade. So anything in the vial, this empty vial, which is going to get the vaccine, everything is destroyed. No bacteria or virus can survive. And it's all automated, so as you can see, it's going on, on the conveyor belt through this tunnel and into the filling area. Now, this is what we call as an isolator line. So you can see all the people here who are handling the product, they never come into contact with the product because, it's only from a human being that you can transfer from breath or touch and contaminate the product. So not only are they completely covered in their clothing, but through this isolator line, and you see this, you put your hands through it, only if you need to fix something or modify something if something's out of place. But this is where the product is being filled into the vials that you saw being washed and sterilized.
Serum started with just producing vaccine for tetanus, but it's producing a lot more vaccines now. What is the next big thing you think?
A global pandemic flu vaccine is something that we're working on, and I think the world will need that. Not only for the annual flu cases, but God forbid there's a flu pandemic. I think we are very well poised to make 1.5, 2 billion doses and roll it out very quickly to protect the world. And we have, of course, the other vaccines, as we talked about, HPV and malaria, that we've just launched, and we're going to scale that up as well. Right here is the final step, actually, which back in the day you'd sit under a light to check the vial, and that was done manually. It was very slow, and you know, the human eye can always miss something which is very small, like a particulate matter in the vial. So here you have 9 cameras examining at a very, very, very low definition, at a very high magnification rather, to see if there's any particles in the vial before it finally goes out and packed and is shipped out.
The strategy you've adopted is very different from the strategy your father adopted. What does Dad think about where Serum is right now and what you have achieved?
Well, I think he'd be very happy to see where we are now. I was certainly more ambitious in terms of wanting to, go more global and reach more countries and make new vaccines. But I would say there are differences in his strategy, but a lot of similarities also, where I share his passion of keeping prices very affordable and accessible. And I try to make all the decisions in our investments and technologies to be able to do that. Even during the COVID pandemic, we could have charged $10, $15. We charged $3 with the support of Gates Foundation, Gavi, UNICEF, and working with all our partners together. So I think that's where we have similarities in our ways of thinking and reaching the countries.
So he's proud of what you've achieved?
I hope so. You'll have to ask him that.
Coming up, tackling India's big challenges.
We spread the word around that, there is a place where you can come. If you can't afford to get treated, then we'll pay for everything and take care of everything.
When Latitude returns. Dedicated to his mother, the Adar Poonawalla Memorial Hospital is an example of where Adar Poonawalla is using Serum's financial success to make an impact in the wider world.
Adar, other than vaccines, philanthropy is very huge. We're in a hospital where it can seat about 100 patients.
At the moment, and we're expanding to 200 now in the new wing.
What's the thinking behind this hospital?
Well, again, it's an extension of our Health for All and providing affordable, at-cost care. So it's totally subsidized, and whether it's hospital beds and procedures and medicines that we take care of here with the patients, we go into obviously a loss every year because it's from our foundation. And as I said, we've got 3 pillars. We've got the hospital and the healthcare outreach programs. We've got our waste management and our schools and education. So we're trying to give the best quality of healthcare possible, but completely subsidized for those who don't have insurance, who can't afford it, and quite frankly wouldn't know where to do these procedures if they had to.
So it's no procedure that cannot be done in this hospital?
Correct. And we're in our new wing also putting up all the equipments for cancer therapies and cath labs and so many other things, whether it's a brain tumor or a heart operation or whatever it is, we can now do it all.
So you bring costs down by what 50% for the
much more than that. If you were to go to a private hospital here, it would be probably a factor of 6 or 7 times as expensive to do it. So we're just doing it at cost. In fact, a lot of patients who can't even afford anything, we just do it free of cost.
For Adar Poonawalla, changing lives is as important as saving them. From healthcare to schools and the environment, he's dedicated time and resources to solving some of the world's biggest problems.
That is why his foundation is also focusing on sustainability.
The idea was, and we started in 2015, can private sector play a role in helping the government with waste management and sustainability. So the idea was to first pick up all the waste, like you can see with these electric machines. We have 450 trucks and machines that we privately fund, employ all the staff.
Well, it started small, wasn't it?
Yes, we started with just 50. And now we're in almost half the city. And we're picking up and processing 100 tons on a daily basis. And we convert the plastic to yarn, so that can be used for clothing. And the wet waste that we pick up, instead of landing up at landfills and then, the methane going up into the atmosphere, which can never then be taken out, we convert that to biogas. So that can be used for mobility and for powering, industry and all of that. So, finally having an end game to the waste. It's not just picking it up and putting it at a landfill. It's about converting that to something productive. And of course, to deal with the plastic scourge.
But why is this important to you personally?
Well, I think, a lot of philanthropy goes into education, healthcare, so many other areas. But I found waste management was something that people weren't really addressing or funding or spending time to execute and figuring out, how to deal with it. And, again, as a proud citizen of my country, I couldn't bear to see so much waste lying on the sides of the roads.
You talk about sustainability. It's interesting because when you were in Davos, people were questioning you about flying your own private jet, and your answer was?
Well, my answer was that I could fly 10,000 times a year, and I would still be offsetting, the waste of the fuel consumption. It was just a, anecdote, or just to put it in perspective of the scale at which we're operating to, offset our methane, CO2, and other wasteful things that humanity has to deal with.
Problem solving in action. An example, Adar Poonawalla says political leaders should follow.
Earlier you talked about how governments are not looking at healthcare and investing in healthcare as much as they should. What's the message you'd like to send to those governments?
Well, I think a healthier population is always going to be a more productive population, and that's good for the economy, it's good for everything. I think it's common sense. It's just that sometimes the political will isn't there in some of these countries to prioritize. They want to do it, but they have these other priorities. So I hope that they can keep this as a priority, because a workforce that is 20 or 30% down during a pandemic or an outbreak, or is suffering from endemic disease in certain areas, there's certain diseases that keep spreading, is not healthy, it's not productive. And if you want everyone to perform at their best, and you want healthcare costs to be down, you don't want to be burdened with insurance costs and other costs. I think it's important to invest early in health, in child health, in women's health, and I hope that continues both in India and other parts.
We know COVID took the world by surprise, and some say disease X is coming sooner than you expect. Is there a sense when disease X might hit the world?
No, I'm not losing sleep over which day and when it's going to come out, but we're definitely prepared. We have a huge testing infrastructure in India, for example. We can detect now, new diseases that can come about, and if they're spreading, then, we can take action. We've got a huge vaccine and pharmaceutical industry in India. So India is very well, I think, poised. When the crisis comes, we stick to what we've committed. I think that's important. So let's see what happens.